Sometimes we are tempted to dismiss our biblical creation stories as being primitive stories, pre-Enlightenment stories, stories that sought to explain what was not understood. But not in our tradition. In the wisdom of progressive Christianity, we embrace our mythical stories as stories of deep truth. And so today we are invited to think more deeply about the truth to be found in our creation stories. Will you join me in prayer? Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. My grandfather was a stone cutter. He made his living by chiseling blocks of granite day after day after day. When my dad was a boy, he used to take lunch to his father at the noon hour. And when he stood in the door of the workroom at the company where his father worked, he couldn't see his father at his workstation because the cloud of stone dust was impenetrable. I know my grandfather only through pictures. He died from breathing stone dust into his lungs before I was old enough to remember him. If you want to get into an argument with me, then start moaning about the intrusiveness of governmental regulatory agencies. I never had a relationship with my paternal grandfather because the company that he worked for decided not to invest the money in a proper ventilation system. I have a cousin in West Virginia whose name is Nancy Ann Stout. She devoted her entire career to establishing safe work standards through NIOSH, the National Organization for Occupational Health and Safety. I couldn't be prouder of her. My grandfather's story is part of my creation story. Everything I value, everything I know about how to make meaning in this world has been shaped by my creation story. My creation story has taught me that free enterprise is never free. Someone has to pay. And the person who pays the most is usually the person with the least amount of power and influence. My father was a telephone man. He worked his way up from climbing poles and stringing cables to installing telephone systems in people's homes and businesses, to working PBX, to managing the computerized communication system in the Western Electric plant in Allentown, Pennsylvania. My father took a great deal of pride in his craftsmanship. At the end of every installation, he would pull out his Sharpie, and on the inside cover of a junction box somewhere, he would sign his name in beautiful calligraphy, by Ott. He wanted the next service person who came to know who was responsible for that installation. With a high school diploma, my father earned a good wage because he was a union member of the Communication Workers of America. Ma Bell did not pay him a wage sufficient to send me through 4 years of undergraduate college education voluntarily. My father earned a good wage because of the power of collective bargaining that brought Bell Telephone of Pennsylvania to the table to negotiate in good faith. I have only ever written one letter to a governor. That was this past year, to Governor Snyder, when he signed into law the right to work legislation. My creation story has taught me the importance of collective bargaining. I would not be here today without it. Everybody in this room has their own creation story. They are the stories that shape our values, our priorities, our ways of viewing the world around us. Everyone's creation story is equally valid and equally true. Whether or not they are factually verifiable, they are true. They are the most powerful stories in the world because they are the stories of our being. Whenever we find ourselves smacking heads with each other, it's often a good idea for us to step back from the issue and begin exploring each other's creation stories. When we understand where we've come from, it's a lot easier to appreciate and to respect the positions that we've taken on whatever issue we're dealing with at the moment. Personal autonomy is a myth. None of us are self-made people. We are created in the image of our ancestors. We carry their DNA in our bodies. We carry the wisdom of their collective experiences in our psyches. Their faith and their fears animate our souls. That's not to say we are hostages to our history. But it is to say that if we ignore our creation stories, we do so at great peril. We are where we are today largely because of where we've come from. This morning we heard part of the second creation story. There are two creation stories in the opening chapters of the book of Genesis. There are two more creation stories in the book of Psalms. There's another creation story in Proverbs. There's another creation story at the beginning of the Gospel of John. They are all important stories. They're all valid stories. They're all true stories. They are the stories that teach us about our identity and our purpose and our destiny. Like every good creation story, the one that we heard this morning has an important lesson, has many important lessons to teach us about who we are created to be. It's a beautiful creation story, one of the most important stories of our faith. This creation story, the story of the Garden of Eden, has a profound message about our common origin. It's the story that reminds us that we all come from the same dust of the earth. All of us come from that same dust. And all of us have been animated with the same ruach, the same breath of God, the same Spirit of God. All of us have this common origin. Kevin Bacon's 6 degrees of separation should never have become a cultural phenomenon. It's in our creation story. We all come from a common origin. When we forget that part of our creation story, then we begin to have a distorted sense of ourselves, a sense that's distorted by notions of privilege and entitlement and class and wealth. Our creation story is the foundation for our nation's story. Our Constitution harkens back to our common ancestry, those unalienable rights of life and liberty and pursuit of happiness are tied to our common origin, to our creation story. And when we get it wrong, when we forget, and we begin treating some groups of people as though they are less privileged than others, Afro-Americans, women, immigrants, same-gender loving people. When we say some people belong more than others, the corrective always comes from our going back and recovering our creation story, our story of our common origin. All of us, from the same dust, all of us, with the same breath. Our creation story reminds us of our origin, of this notion that we are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights. Our creation story also reminds us that as earthlings, the earth is literally the ground of our being. That our purpose for being here is linked to the ground. Did you hear it in our creation story? This garden paradise. We have been placed in the midst of this garden paradise to till and to keep it. That's our work. We've been placed in the midst of the garden to till and keep the paradise. When we forget our creation story, when we forget our purpose for being stewards of creation, then creation is in peril. Instead of tilling and keeping, we feel justified consuming and depleting for our own pleasure and profit. Our creation story reminds us of who we are, why we're here, where we're heading. Like every creation story, this creation story can be distorted and exploited, and it has been throughout our history. Over the last centuries, this creation story has been used to justify patriarchal hierarchy. The man came first. The woman was taken out of man. She depends on him. That's her rightful place in the world. It's been used to defend the exclusivity of heterosexual marriage. It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. It's been used to refute scientific exploration of the origins of the species and the origins of the universe. The Scopes monkey trial was tied to this story. It's still the foundation for the crazy talk about creationism and intelligent design being taught in science classes. It's a story that's been used to blame and shame people with doctrines of original sin and substitutionary atonement. Anytime we read a creation story as anything other than myth, we strip it of its power and we turn it into a nonsense story. Fortunately, we have other creation stories in our biblical tradition, stories that correct us when we distort and edit the true story of our origin. My personal creation story tells me I will never be an academic. I will never be a scholar. I will never make my life living in an ivy-covered tower. My creation story tells me I have to work with my hands. I come from people who chisel stone and climb poles and string cable. I have to use my hands to make things, to change things, to add value to the things I touch. You have your own creation story. It's the story that defines who you are, what you do, where you're going. All of us have our creation stories. They are stories that are not rooted in scientific evidence. They are stories that are rooted in theology. Stories that remind us what it means to be in relationship with God, what it means to be in relationship with God's creation, what it means to be in relationship with all of God's people. We have our personal creation stories, and we have our collective creation stories. The stories that remind us of who we are as a people of faith. Stories about God and creation and our relationship to both. Those are the stories that we need to recover, and we need to retell, and we need to pass on to future generations, lest we forget who we are. Amen.